आज हम दुनिया की पांचवी बड़ी अर्थव्यवस्था है।
You predict that India will likely be a superpower.
India is being referred to as the next global superpower.
India will become the next superpower.
Superpower, global power.
आने वाले 5 साल में देश पहले 3 वैश्विक इकोनॉमी में अपना जगह ले लेगा।
India just overtook the United Kingdom to become the 5th largest economy in the world. Now, obviously, objectively speaking, that means we are bigger than the United Kingdom, right? But despite being the smaller country, the United Kingdom has more fancy vehicles on their road. And to add to that, the roads are actually drivable. Incomes are higher, inequality is lesser, and the average person can aspire to lead a better life. Oh, and just in case you did not know, the United Kingdom is not a superpower to begin with. So the question begs to be asked, is India even ready to be a superpower? In this video, we'll try and understand what are the things that hold this country back from becoming a superpower. What are its biggest weaknesses that prevent us from success and unlocking our potential. Now through this video, I'm going to give you some shocking data about India that I'm sure you haven't read anywhere else, so stay tuned till the end. Okay, so let's get started with the definition of a superpower. Any country that has excellent military strength and also economic growth, where not only would the average citizen of that country feel protected, they would also have ample opportunity and space to grow and improve their individual lives. And as you know, in 2024, there are two major world powers, the United States that has a very large defense budget of $916 billion and China which has $296 billion. Along with these massive defense budgets, their economies also continue to grow and business continues to boom. Now here's something to actually be proud of. India in terms of defense is not far behind. It has the 4th largest defense budget in the entire world, just behind Russia at $83 billion. And along with that, India is also a nuclear armed nation. So the major point that I'm trying to make here is that from a defense perspective, we do not need to worry. However, from an economic perspective, there is a lot to worry about. In a time like 2024, where the world is so interconnected and every single country trades with one another, everyone tries to avoid the possibility of full-blown war. Countries try and flex their muscles through economic strength. And when it comes to economic strength, there are a few major weaknesses in India. I'm sure we've seen those headlines that with this type of growth, the Indian rupee has the potential to overtake the US dollar and become a reserve currency. For the ones that don't know, a reserve currency is any currency that is used in international trade, such as the US dollar, the euro, or the British pound. But all of that only happens when your country achieves trade dominance, when your country has booming businesses, when there is long-term sustainable growth. Pay attention to that word here, and I will bring up one of the biggest problems that plague the Indian economy today, and that factor is jobless economic growth. So the World Bank said that India's growth forecast for the current year would be 7%, and going forward it would continue to remain strong. Now this growth rate is well above the national average for so many countries, but in spite of that, do you know what the unemployment rate was for India in June this year? A shocking 9.2%. So there was growth, and this growth is also forecast to be constant going forward. But in spite of that, there is so much of unemployment. So the question has to be asked that where is this growth going? If you contrast this unemployment rate with that of the US, you would see just 4.1%. For Germany, it is as low as 3.1%. For China, it is 5.1%. And yet we stand at a figure which is almost 2 times of this. So what exactly is the issue? The biggest issue lies in a double-edged sword. That is our population. And there are 2 main problems here. Number one, our population is extremely young and inexperienced. So when the entrants in the job market are inexperienced and there happen to be a large number of them, we see a buyer's market when it comes to labor. So every year there are a lot of new inexperienced entrants in the workforce and they accept lower wages, because of which the existing, more experienced candidates find it even more difficult to get a job. So even though companies and businesses are able to produce more and acquire cheaper talent, the unemployment rate continues to rise. And the second reason is the big paradox that is the Indian unemployment market. All of our country's business growth comes from a labor market that is incredibly high skill and low employment. Now, what does that mean? Our country makes money primarily from services and large-scale capital-intensive manufacturing. Now, what does that mean? Look at Tata Consultancy Services, one of India's largest IT businesses, for example. This company is able to produce billions of dollars in profits while having a relatively smaller workforce. For example, the IT sector just has 45 million employees in the country, but it contributes to 7.5% of the country's GDP. Meaning, due to the structural dynamics of our country where we rely so heavily on services, we end up making a lot of money from these services, but we don't employ as many people in these said services. On the other hand, look at capital-intensive manufacturing. India is also currently championing semiconductors. There are multiple private companies and the government which are heavily investing in this industry, but in spite of that, this is not an industry where we could see large-scale employment. Why? Because the output or the value of these semiconductors might be incredibly high. The automation that is involved in manufacturing them is so high that it doesn't end up generating a lot of employment. Long story short, you need a lot of robots to make semiconductors, not people. Now contrast this with farming. The exact number of farmers in India is very difficult to determine, but it ranges between 40 and 150 million farmers. But wait a minute, I know what you're thinking. There is still growth, right? We're still growing at a very healthy pace. But here's the shocking ground reality underneath those fancy headlines about our country's growth. The people of this country are not benefiting from that growth. So if growth in a country doesn't reach everyone, we see widespread inequality, which is exactly what is happening in India right now. Now, back in 2016, there was a report that called India the second most unequal country in the world after Russia. Now, I know what you might say, wait, this was 2016. Things have changed since then. Well, are you sure about that? Because in 2024, just 1% of all Indians earned almost 1/4 of the country's income. And the same 1% ended up controlling nearly half of the entire country's wealth. What's even more shocking is that just 10% of the country's people control more than 77% of all wealth. And what's tiring to look at is that you just need to make more than 25,000 rupees a month to be in this top 10%. Making north of $300 a month puts you in the top 10% of the world's largest democracy. Well, if you're shocked by the reality check up until this point, I'm about to shock you even more. And if you like what you see so far, consider subscribing to our channel before we move ahead. Now, let me tell you something. You remember that 9.2% unemployment metric I just told you? Well, most unemployment metrics that you see in India are given to you by the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, or the CMIE. Now, this is not a governmental body. They're an NGO that collect data about the Indian economy in various spheres every single year because the government doesn't. Now, I'm not saying this to blame the government, but the thing is, collecting data in India is a huge challenge. There are so many people, so many districts, so many places with tribal population that is extremely cautious and wary of anyone that comes there to collect data. And that is the reason the government collects data every 5 years instead of yearly. The most recent such data collection happened in 2017, but that data has still not been released to the public. The point that I'm trying to make here is that when there are so many people, when it is so difficult to collect data, it is also very difficult to forecast or predict or find things such as the actual true unemployment rate in the country. So for the time being, let's just assume the best case scenario that our unemployment rate is actually 9.2% and not more. Well, if we want to become a superpower, we need to fix that and we need to get that rate lower. And how does that happen? When we allow businesses to flourish. Where comes another challenge. Doing a business in India is not easy at all. Consider one of the simplest and most popular businesses in the world, running a restaurant. If you wish to start your own restaurant in the city of Mumbai or the city of dreams, you would require 33 different types of licenses. If you also plan on serving alcohol at this restaurant, you would require 9 additional licenses. But Aditya, it's very difficult to start a restaurant in any country in the world. Every place you require multiple licenses. Well, that's very true. If you contrast this to New York City in the US, you need about 8 to 10 licenses to do this. If you look at the United Kingdom, you need about 8. If you look at Dubai, you just need about 2 core licenses. And on top of that, bribing your way out to secure all of these licenses is not really a concern in these countries. Now, here's the thing. Corruption is an entirely different debate, but this form of licensing requirements actually makes it difficult to do business, and this ends up creating monopolies and oligopolies. Basically, an environment where one or maybe 2 to 3 big players control the entire supply for a particular industry. As on this day, it is nearly impossible to start a telecom business or a financial services business from scratch in India unless you have billions of dollars in capital. The reason being, the barriers to entry are extremely high, and that is what affects this growth rate and the employment in the country. Now, oftentimes external investors look at one major factor before investing in a country, and that is its ease of doing business. If we continue with this red tapeism and this constant need for licensing and regulation, then it would be more and more difficult to source external investment in this country, and without investment we wouldn't be able to create enough jobs. Now let's say somehow we overcome all of this and manage to start a bunch of businesses. The road ahead is still extremely rocky because we have to deal with taxes. In spite of being one of the poorest countries in the world, India continues to have a draconian tax system. Indian corporations pay 25% of corporate income tax. Indian individuals pay north of 31.2% of income tax. The Indian consumer on average pays between 12 and 28% in indirect tax in the form of goods and services tax, making India one of the highest tax nations in the world. Oh, and you remember that entire charade I gave you about inequality? Well, the poorest Indians pay nearly 66% of all the goods and services tax that is collected in the country. Now, this has two major impacts. Number one, investments become less attractive in the country. Investors often think of their post-tax returns, and if these post-tax returns do not make sense to them, they refuse to pump money in the country. And the second reason being, taxes reduce the disposable income that people have, which in turn reduces consumption. If people don't spend as much, it becomes difficult for the country to reap benefits of growth. Additionally, very high levels of indirect taxes also take away pricing power from small businesses. While sales taxes are between 2 and 5% in most countries, GST in India is between 12 and 18% for most products. This eats away at businesses' margins, and it also takes away their pricing power. Not to mention, it makes things more expensive for you and me. Long story short, nobody wins. Now, a superpower means any country on which other countries rely on for various objectives. We have been championing Make in India for the longest time, but in spite of that, our imports have continued to grow faster than our exports. Nearly 82% of all Indian imports are crude oil, pharmaceuticals, electronics and machinery. We import most things that we require. China, the country that our government is at loggerheads with, continues to be our largest trading partner. But wait, it's not all gloomy. We have still come a long way. India is probably the only country in the world where you do not have to wait 2 months for a doctor's appointment. If you manage to build a life for yourself that is either middle class or above, things get significantly easier. Around the world, there are two extremes. The countries such as UK and Germany, which have free healthcare, have extremely long wait times when it comes to medical services. Or places like the US, where medical services will literally get you bankrupt. On the other hand, back home, you can just call your doctor and tell them that I am coming to your clinic. Digital payments boomed in India like there was no tomorrow in just less than 5 years. Today, we are at a point where PwC came out with a report which said that by 2029, we could easily reach a transaction volume of nearly $500 billion by 2029. You look at fruit vendors, your house help, grocery stores, auto drivers, every single one of them have a QR code which helps you make digital payments seamlessly. For a country which isn't even 100 years old and has historically lived in poverty, that is a big deal. In the city of Mumbai, you could take an auto ride in an Uber for less than $1 and pay for it via credit card. The billion-dollar quick commerce industry of India lets you order one single can of Diet Coke to your house at 2 a.m. in the night. The point is, as you climb the income ladder in India, life actually gets significantly better, but it's just very difficult to climb this ladder. And I'm 100% sure we'll become a superpower the day we grow. The only caveat here is that the day we all grow, and not just a select few like you and me.